Christen, good to see you. Thanks for making a bit of
Thank
time to
you.
come and have a chat with me. I wanted to kick off with something that you said to me in the past. You made the point, and I think it's a really interesting point. You made the point that people think that burnout is about individual resilience or lack of. Your point was it's not really about individuals, it's about systems and structures. I mean, what do you mean by that? And why, I mean, how do systems and structures help reduce, or how can they be used to help reduce burnout? And just tell us about the costs involved in those sorts of things.
Yeah, okay. So I think a lot of people think that burnout is caused by workload, which would make sense, but it's not. It's caused by carrying that responsibility without that control and being stuck inside that unresolved ambiguity that we all find when we're sat in meetings for a long period of time or our processes are not completely clear. And like I said, burnout is still treated as like an individual resilience issue. When it's not, it is the design of the system. It is poor decision design or role clarity. I think something that comes up a lot is those reoccurring meetings that we always have, which links
Yeah.
to burnout. And I did some calculations the other day and found that, for example, if we had one reoccurring meeting for the year, say that you've got 12 senior leaders within that meeting, that's 624 hours each year. Even at a modest rate of, say, £90 an hour, that's £56,000 that you have spent on a reoccurring meeting that perhaps hasn't changed anything. And I think that links very tightly to burnout.
Yeah. Okay. So just, I mean, that's a really interesting statistic. I mean, the costs involved are actually quite phenomenal when you start to dig into it, aren't they? Just tell us about, your work as an organizational, I mean, this is not the right title, but I kind of think of you as an organizational therapist, really. You help rectify those problems for organizations by talking with them, don't you? Really, that's what you do. I mean, just tell us about how often you see those kind of problems, what sort of organizations have those problems. I mean, how does the business world look to people like you? I mean, I know how it looks to people like me who run businesses, but how does it look to people like you that look in?
Yeah, I think it is. My title is organisational psychologist. So yes, there's a talking side of it that is very, very important, and noticing what is not being said, particularly when you're in more senior level meetings, because you know people project whatever they wish to have within the organisation, and we have to recognise what is the crux of the issue here, what is the root cause of this problem. So, how I see it is, my mission really is to make organizations faster because I see it very clearly that things can be a lot better, they can be a lot more effective, they can be a lot healthier. And I think most leaders assume that performance problems are caused by capability or motivation. And it's a little bit controversial to say, I suppose, given the role that I'm in, but a lot of people then assign a leadership development program. Okay, so it's capability, we need to fix this skill. And then nothing changes. That training is not implemented, it's not bespoke, doesn't fix the actual problem that we're looking for or at. And the other side is motivation. So people get very frustrated that they think, okay, people just aren't motivated. We assume that people aren't motivated within their role. In reality, a lot of the damage is structural. So it is decisions that take too long, which erodes trust, work multiplies, and then talented people get stuck doing tasks that they shouldn't be doing. I talk a lot about that capability of individuals that are high performers, and then they're doing low value work, and the cost attached to that is huge.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a quite a worrying perspective when you put it that way. I mean, let me ask you about the specifics of that. So, I mean, I'm absolutely sure that you're correct, right? You're not the first organizational psychologist I've spoken to who said similar things. How do
Mhm.
you? I mean, this is for people that perhaps don't understand how these things work, including me. How do you diagnose that? I mean, you go to an organization, I mean, how does the diagnostic bit work? How do you go from, hello, everybody, I'm here to do this, to this is the analysis of the situation, the challenges that this organization is facing? I mean, just talk us through the diagnostic bit to start with.
Yeah, I think there's a total cost of inefficiency. So I try and map this to three different avenues. So a speed tax, these are the terms that I use. So speed tax is in the cost of the slow decision making, the delayed execution, it's the value of the lost time. Yeah. So I would look at, okay, so how many projects do you have that sit there that are 90% done for months, or who is it that you have that decides what, and how long does that take for them to make those decisions? I speak to stakeholders. I might conduct anonymous surveys for people that might want to
Yeah.
speak about, what is not going on in front of other people, and yeah, and then just sort of summarize that all into, okay, this is where the decisions are being stuck. Okay, so that's the decision side of it. Then I look at the what I call like the bloat tax. So this is what I'm talking about, the reoccurring meetings. Okay, so let's map how many meetings you've got this month. Which one of those can you completely cut? Which one of those are particularly important? You make decisions from it, and how is it structured? That's really important. I think a lot of people think that a very clear agenda will work. A clear agenda won't work if nobody reads it to start with, and if
Yeah.
you haven't got any outcomes at the end, and then sort of the workflow mapping around that as well. So what decision goes to who, and how long does that sit with that person? So it's a lot about monitoring. And I think people want a quick fix, but you have to do that monitoring part at the beginning to be able to uncover the root cause. And then the third one that I do is the talent tax. And this is the one that I talked about in terms of the misusing capability
Yeah.
and the unfunded leadership. So you've got people that have been promoted without support, they don't have leadership skills, that then impacts all the people that they lead. Um, so yeah, those are the three things that I
Okay.
look for.
Okay. So what's interesting about what you've just described, well, I think it's interesting, is that you've quantified it in the form of a tax. So what you're saying, just to make sure I understand this correctly, what you're saying is if people don't get these things right, in effect they're paying an additional tax because it's
Yeah,
costing them money. Yeah, that's
yeah,
what you're saying, isn't it? Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So okay, so once you've identified uh, the scale of the tax, for want of a better way of describing it, you've got an organization that's paying a lot of money out because they're not doing things as well as they could be. Tell me about the next bit. I mean, what do you then do? How do you help? I guess this is the therapy bit, really. How do you help the CEO, the board, the senior leadership team fix those things? Because if they were easy to fix, it strikes me that they would have fixed them themselves. So these
Yeah.
sound to me to be quite complex and deeply embedded problems. I mean, how do you help people fix those things?
Making recommendations, the first thing I do is a 90-day roadmap. So
Yeah,
that might look like, okay, so if we've got the speed tax, okay, so we move from alignment, which is very common when we're in meetings. We use meetings for alignment. No, we should be using them for decision clarity. So when you come out of that meeting, there's one owner, a tight consultation, and a clear deadline. Very clear. Set decisions thresholds, because I think a lot of people escalate because of feeling uncertain about their own decisions. So, what actually requires escalation? Set that clear expectation, and what doesn't, and then track that decision latency. So that's for the speed tax. Then for the bloat tax, I think about, where have we got duplicate work?
yeah,
Where have you set KPIs? Because KPIs are should be very specific, but where have you set them and they haven't been used to decide anything? So that's the other one. And then for the talent tax, that might look like training. It might do, but it would be very bespoke. And I would ask people to look at, okay, where do you see your best people spending their time firefighting? What does that look like? What is the time tracker for that?
yeah,
Um, because the impact is huge. And again, that links so closely to burnout, because if you've got people that are being impacted by all these different taxes, they quietly disengage, and that is how you get back. That's why people leave. It's not usually a loud thing. People just quietly disengage and then they leave because they can't cope with what they're being put up with, at work.
yeah. And they move to somewhere that's more attractive or easier or better paid or whatever. Yeah, I get that. Okay. Let me ask you about that process though, because I mean, it's a very interesting model you've developed there. And I mean, I think the idea of the way organisations pay a tax for not doing things well. It's a very good way to put it, actually. What you're doing, though, is challenging the status quo. And we all know, one of the biggest biases people have is for the status quo. I mean, what's your take on effect? How do you challenge the status quo without getting people to kind of react negatively to that? I mean, how do you go about that? Because it's a very difficult, again, very difficult challenge to say to people, you're doing it all wrong. I mean, that's, just to go in and say you're doing it all wrong is not really the best way to approach it, I don't think, is it? What's your kind of take on that issue?
I think that's what an organisational psychologist does. They facilitate those conversations that are particularly
Mm.
uneasy, and are a little bit more sensitive, and you just do that in a diplomatic manner. So my approach wouldn't be to come in and tell you, no, you're doing this all wrong, and this is not working. My approach is, okay, you've done really well, but you've grown. And the difference is that you can't, like I said to you earlier, you can't run a 50-person business the same way that you run a 100-person business. Let me help you to make it more efficient so that you can get more people out of your more um, sort of for your buck, more things out of the people that you're working with. So you have to you frame it in like an advantage rather
Because
than you're
are
doing it
you
wrong.
saying then that it's really about productivity?
Mm, no, well, no, because I look at productivity in terms of that's a people capacity, whereas
Right,
what I'm talking about is systems that don't work well.
right, okay. So you're about fixing systems or about improving systems that are already in place. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I've worked in several organisations where you've got one or two people that are really productive. They're your top performers, and they're carrying the system. And like I said earlier, they then carry the system. They burn out, then they go off sick, then they come back, and things don't change. They're like the informal glue, if you like. They're the ones that chase everything. They meet the deadlines. The business thinks they're really high performing, but they're subsidizing that broken design of, well, this is just how we do it, and this is how we've done it for a long period of time. So we've got to carry on doing it that way.
Yeah, yeah. Let me ask you about getting the right people on the bus. I mean, we talked, I think, a while ago about. I mean, I think you said something to me about people shouldn't recruit to specific roles. You recruit to reduce friction, I think was the point you made. I think it's a very interesting idea. I mean, just talk us through how you think people should approach getting the right people on the bus. I mean, I don't think anyone disputes that you want the right people on the bus, but it's very easy to say get the right people on the bus. It's much more difficult to do, isn't it? I mean, give us your
Yeah.
take on that, and just tell us about this idea of recruiting to reduce friction, because I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, so you need to map where the biggest friction is within your organization. So where are there parts where it's not about capability or about adding more headcount? It is about, this is something that either people don't know about or they're struggling to approach it in a certain way. And those moments really, really matter. So when you bring that person on board, that entry part is really, really important because it links to the psychological contract that we talked about. So, if I give you an example, so I worked with an organization that was growing really quickly, felt very stuck. Projects were slow, decisions kept escalating, senior leaders felt, overloaded. Their diagnosis was, right, this is a capability problem. So there's lack of innovation, there was lack of ownership. So they hired a really, really senior, very capable person that came in with autonomy, with influence and change and everything like that. The recruitment process was actually very, very good, but it didn't address the real problem that the organisation was really heavily governed. So decisions did require multiple approvals. The risk was very tightly controlled, and there was a lot of, I keep talking about, unspoken rules about who could do what, when, to whom. And what actually happened was, within the first few weeks, the new hire was drowning in approvals, in stakeholder mapping, in politics. Every attempt they had for that innovation was quietly blocked because the system broke that off. And then the organisation says they're very confused. We've hired someone really senior. Why aren't they driving change? Well, it looked like a capability issue, but it wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, what's going through my mind as you're speaking is that that could certainly apply to government, couldn't it? Maybe you should do a bit of work with them, but you can
Well,
see it in the business
exactly.
environment.
Yeah, yeah, it does, but it does a lot of across a lot of private organizations. How often do we say, oh, we'll bring in a new COO or, a very senior level person because they've got the capability and the skills. But if the blockers are actual systemic, then it's not going to
Won't
make any
change, is it?
difference because they're not going to have that autonomy.
Yeah. One of the things you just mentioned was this idea of a psychological contract with the organization. I mean, for those people that perhaps aren't familiar with that language, I mean, just explain what that means and explain why it's important in terms of how you manage people.
So the psychological contract is something that is not written in the job description. So it isn't the unspoken agreement that you have with your employee. So things such as, I work hard, I'll be rewarded. If I deserve a promotion, then that might happen. It's about that fairness, the predictability, the meaning, those sorts of things. It's not about perks or loyalty or sort of feeling safe. And I think most psychological contract breaches happen during those rational, very well-intentioned decisions where you say you're going to do something and then it doesn't happen. Okay, fine, that does happen, but you're not honest with that person about why that was.
Mm.
And that is where the trust breaks down very, very quickly. People then disengage. The story changes without actually being acknowledged. That's the most important saying, I would say. That story has changed and it hasn't been acknowledged. And that might be because the leader doesn't feel confident approaching conflict or approaching that conversation, but it's so important to do that.
Yeah. And how do, I mean, if leaders feel they've done that, I mean, sorry, I'm just quite interested in that. What would you suggest people do to fix that? I mean, first of all, I guess you've got to acknowledge that it's happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you acknowledge that it's happened, you have that conversation with that individual, and you ask, coaching questions rather than, normal sort of, what's my feedback on my performance? How do you think I'm doing as a leader? You ask it in a different way in terms of what do you think I've missed here?
Yeah.
And give them the space to do that and the safe space to do that. And a lot of that comes from psychological safety, which is another term in terms of it's safe for me to challenge you. And when I do challenge you, it is not rushed or you're not defensive or dismissive around it. You're open to that conversation,
Mm.
but also for the leader to role model that as well. The leader has to be open about their own mistakes because that's the strongest, example of then people feeling safe to do the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's all well and good, but obviously not all employees are necessarily going to be happy with that. I mean, I've certainly seen that in the past. I mean, one of the things that's interesting for people today, in a way that wasn't the case 20 years ago, is that people are building businesses in, if you like, in the age of social media, where anyone can go and post on Facebook or post on LinkedIn about what's happening in their business, or I mean, there is an extraordinary amount of scrutiny around things at the moment. I mean, what you're doing, it seems to me, is kind of, I mean, this is probably not the right way to put it, but you're kind of opening a can of worms for leaders and saying, look, you need to sort these things out. You're going to have even bigger problems. I mean, how does that feel in this kind of, when you're doing that in the age of social media? I mean, what are your thoughts on that challenge? Because everything's visible in a way that it wasn't 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, what's the risk of not doing it? That would be my question. So yes, it might be difficult to hear, but the risk of not having that conversation or not doing something is that that person then leaves or it what's the word, not it's like contagious of the environment, because they're coming to work and they're feeling that way, that psychological contract is gone, and impacts everybody else around them. This is your, if this is your business, that should be very important to you.
Mm. Mm. I mean, yeah, I can see your point there. I mean, I think there are also risks in opening that can up, though it seems to me. I mean, you're right, there's a risk in not doing that, but there are also risks if you do it and Um, so it's quite a difficult judgment. There's pros and
Mhm.
cons on both sides, I think. Um, yeah,
On your relationship with that individual, obviously, we're talking more broadly. Um, but I haven't been in a situation where I felt like that wasn't a bad idea, where I felt that was a bad idea. And I think perhaps if that's something that you feel within your organization, then you do need somebody, not that I'm trying to promote myself, but you do need somebody like an organizational psychologist to come in to facilitate that, to mediate that,
yeah,
to get both sides of the story across. Now, it depends what we're talking about here. I'm not talking about very sensitive, you know, incidents that might have happened. I'm talking about the small things that have shaped that, that feeling in somebody.
yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is a critical friend, really, isn't it? The role of the organizational psychologist being a critical friend is kind of the mirror to see the back of your neck.
Yeah, you hold the mirror up for that organization to say, this is what's actually happening, by the way. And actually, I think sometimes organizational psychologists are used as scapegoats, unfortunately, to deliver that message.
Mm.
I'm happy to do that if it makes a difference. And I think we're skilled to do that in a way that shouldn't harm either side.
Yeah, yeah. And that's about your professionalism, I guess, isn't it? Let
Yeah.
me ask you about the impact on managers of these things, because what you're talking about is managers acknowledging that they've got something wrong.
Yeah.
And in most organizations, not all organizations, but and certainly a lot of organizations, admitting failure, admitting weakness, admitting errors is not the done thing. I mean, there's a culture in startups of kind of fail fast because you use it as a vehicle to learn. Once you get into more established organizations, I guess the kind of organizations you're talking about, they're a little bit bigger, got more staff, and so on. Failure is, I mean, what's the phrase? Success has many parents, failure is an orphan. Nobody necessarily feels comfortable being associated with failures, but what you're doing is saying you should acknowledge failures and be more open about that. Is that a fair summary? And what's the impact of that, or what's the implication of that for managers and the way people manage?
I mean, I would challenge that slightly in terms of nobody feels comfortable with failure. I'm quite happy to fail if I'm then growing from it. We don't really grow unless we fail first, or if we, try things out that don't might not necessarily work. So I think people should be open to failure, and anybody who owns their own business has probably failed quite a lot and is
Yeah,
quite used to that.
yeah, yeah.
What was your second question there? Sorry.
It's this thing about, I guess it's about managers being willing to be vulnerable in front of people. Because there's one thing to acknowledge you screwed something up. It's another thing to talk about it in front of a bunch of staff. Um,
Mm,
you know, so like I say, to come back to your earlier point about culture, some cultures are supportive of that. Some cultures are a lot less supportive of that.
yeah. Yeah, I suppose, yeah, there are, but then if I was going into those organizations, then that would be one of the things that I would start with. What is it that you feel that you can't say, and why?
Mm.
What's happened previously that means that you don't feel comfortable to share this? And yeah, there is a lot of cutthroat organizations out there, but for me, what I've learned is that culture is shaped more by what leaders tolerate than what they say.
Mm.
That tolerance of that behavior speaks a lot louder than you being a little bit more direct.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting point. That actually, I've heard other people say that, and I think that also your point about what people will tolerate. I mean
Mm,
that covers a lot of things, doesn't it? That covers a lot
yeah,
of
it
stuff that goes
does.
on. That kind of toxic behavior that people just don't acknowledge and tolerate it, and that can be,
Exactly.
pretty damaging. Would be my reading of some of those things.
Very damaging, and I think perhaps as a culture, particularly in the UK, actually in other countries as well, we are a little bit more, or can be a little bit more polite, or we have that conflict avoidance. We're not particularly um, good at taking feedback. There's a lot in that area that needs to be done in terms of how you frame feedback and have a culture of feedback. but we see that conflict avoidance and we think, well, okay, that's really kind to be doing that. Underneath all of that, you've got teams that are losing trust, they're losing clarity, and essentially they're not feeling happy when they come to work. Um, and actually, from the people that I've spoken to at an employee level or a more junior manager level, one of the most frustrating things for them is that they don't get that feedback. I don't know where I'm going wrong. I don't know what I'm doing really well. I don't know what I need to do to get to a more senior level. So, what does that cause in people? Frustration.
Yeah, yeah. Let's explore that feedback issue because, again, certainly in my experience, you see that, how can I put it, not done well in lots of organizations. I mean, lots of organizations claim to have performance management systems in place. What you often hear from people is that those things don't work very well and they're not done very well. I mean, what's your take on, I mean, what would a good kind of performance management system look like? How should managers be thinking about feedback? Give us a sense of how that should look rather than often does look.
It should be hot feedback in the moment. It shouldn't be something because the more you do hot feedback in the moment, the better that you get at it, at framing it in a way that is positive. Um, I don't particularly believe in performance appraisals, and I think the very word of performance appraisal just causes anxiety in people. And it causes that competition as well. I think it is much more impactful for people to say in the moment, I really like the way you did that. Have you thought about doing it this way? Have you thought about adding this in? Just framing it in a way that it's positively framed rather than negatively framed.
Mm.
There's also a thing called the SBI model. You must have heard of the situation, behavior, impact model. That's one of the good ones to make it very depersonal, and to make it very evidence based. But it needs to be a culture thing rather than, okay, let's have a meeting in 6 months' time about your performance where people sit and wait and then try and prove themselves in 45 minutes, come away from the meeting not being promoted or not, getting what they want out of it, and feeling again frustrated and losing trust.
And how should you go about if you're a CEO that is concerned about that? I mean, what's your thoughts on how to change that situation if you feel that those things aren't working in your business? I mean, what advice would you offer to a CEO to fix that?
To fix the feedback culture,
Yeah.
I would suggest just having perhaps some sort of meeting, even if it's once a month, for you to ask about what's working well and what's not working well. That could be the most simple thing that you could implement. Um, Asking for feedback on your performance itself and being comfortable with that, getting used to it. Although it does come with a caveat that a lot of the time people don't want to give that feedback initially because they're scared about giving feedback to more senior people. Um, but role model that behavior, give that feedback in the meeting and get peers to do it.
Yeah.
Get them to have a peer-to-peer feedback session with somebody that facilitates it.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting about what you've just said, you see, is you're not saying buy this clever software platform. What you're saying is change the behaviors.
Yeah, yeah. Just it's about the people, but it's about whereas a lot of people come from it in terms of let's just have this course or let's give them a course on feedback. It doesn't need to be a course on feedback. You could have somebody facilitate peer-to-peer feedback, and it would be much more impactful than having, this is how you do the SBI model or this is how you do that. No, just let people have their own way of doing it because every organization is different.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. That's a very interesting point that. Let me just ask you about your journey. I mean, you've worked with lots of fairly big organizations, and I mean, you've got a particular skill set in terms of being an organizational psychologist. I mean, when you look back on your journey and the work that you've done advising clients and working with clients to address some of these problems, I mean, what would you say are the biggest things that you've learned along the way? I mean, what's changed, as it were, from when you started to where you are now?
So, I mean, obviously, like I'd mentioned before, I started my journey in the NHS, a very complex
Yeah, yeah.
system that is, very, very high pressured. I think the biggest thing that I have learned is that most leaders do genuinely care, but systems override intent faster than any personality ever could. That's what I would say. That would be my core thing that I've learned, and that's probably not what I used to believe. When I first started, I used to think, well, if leaders cared more, then nurses wouldn't be burnt out, patients wouldn't be sat there not getting the care that they needed. But I think good intentions don't protect organizations from harm. So if you've got leaders that care very, very deeply, that doesn't protect your organization. And like I said, that culture is shaped by leaders, what leaders tolerate more than what they say. So they would be my main things that I've learned.
Yeah. And if you were to start again, what would you do differently?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'll probably start talking about this a little bit earlier, um, because I think I've spent a long time, although it's given me the experience, I've spent a long time sort of weaving in and out and going through the consultancy journey in terms of learning the leadership development or assessment and development, which is the biggest thing that most organisational psychologists do, is that assessment side. Um, I would have taken my natural knack that I've had since I was a child, because it was commented quite a lot when I was a child about, always wanting efficiency, always wanting to get things done really fast.
Right.
And now I realise it's not about getting things done fast. But I knew that that was in me because I just naturally see how things can be done better. And I get naturally frustrated by, you know, why isn't this easier? Why is this so hard? When you call HMRC or you call whoever and you have to sit on hold, those sort of processes, I think, could be easily fixed. Dare I say that?
Yeah, I'm not sure easily fixed. I think they could be fixed.
Easily
I don't think they
fixed.
were easy to fix. If they were easy to fix, they'd have probably been fixed, would be my read.
Well, would they though? Would they? I don't know. I think there's so much red tape. There was a organisation that I worked with who wanted a recruitment process, and I'd been asked to come in to design that, and they said, well, the real problem is, and this was after many conversations, I might add, the real problem is our job description isn't very good. And I said, okay, so do you think perhaps that might be something that we could look at changing? Oh no, because it's got to go through two unions to change it. To me, sometimes we think, if it was easy to change, we would change it. People don't. They don't. They sit with that because that's the way that they've done it. Then what is the impact of that? You've got people that are coming into the organisation who have got mismatched expectations of what they think the job is to what they get. They stay there. They either quietly erode the culture or they leave. What's the impact of that? Cost, time,
Yeah.
the money that costs to then recruit another person.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I certainly agree with you about it would be great if we could find a way through those sorts of things because they do create all sorts of problems. I think my reading of it is perhaps a little bit more difficult than you imply, but maybe I'm just a bit old-fashioned about those things. But and let me
Yeah,
ask you a
sure.
couple of
I'm
other
sure.
let me ask you a couple of other questions before we wind up. I mean, what if you were starting again? If you were somebody that wanted to be an organizational psychologist like you to do the sorts of things that you do, work with the kind of businesses and organizations you work with, I mean, what one piece of advice would you offer them?
For somebody coming into my role,
Yeah,
yeah, a variety. I would suggest that you go and try out different things, so you can figure out what you really enjoy and what you're good at.
right,
That was what I would say.
right. And have you ever been given a really good piece of advice? And if so, what was it?
Um, this is probably not as related. This is more of a saying, but one of my favourite sayings is, "Why do we stay in prison when the door is so wide open?" Have you heard of that one?
Yeah. And why
You
does that,
have.
why do you, why is that important to you? Why do you feel that's good advice?
I think it's important to me because now that we're talking about sort of ease and if it was that easy that we would do it, I think it's important to me because with regards to the possibilities, I would say. And yes, there are things in terms of client appetite, and what we can and can't control. But if we can control it, then why don't we? if we can make that change, then why don't we?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a very good question to ask people, I think. What one last question, which is not so much about you or about the kind of the work you do with organizations. It's about the impact that technology is having at the moment. I mean, all the talk at the moment is AI. Phenomenal technology, got all sorts of potential, and it's in its very early stage at the moment. We're only just a couple of years into the journey. What's your take on the way AI will affect the sort of work that you do, and the the clients that you work with? I mean, what's your reading of how that is going to shake down over the next few years?
Implement it. I'm talking about efficiency. What is AI? It's making things more efficient. And I think it will help with that as a lot in terms of the systems that we put in place. But I think framing it as a competitive advantage, I don't think strategy or technology alone is the competitive advantage if you haven't got that clarity within people or that psychological safety within people. So I think we'll complement it. I think it's going to be the key to helping people to stop burning out,
Mm,
personally.
mm. I mean, it's interesting. Sorry, just your point there about psychological safety. I mean, I do wonder whether, I mean, you hear a lot about AI, but you also hear from people their kind of anxieties around the
Hmm.
impact of AI. And it seems to me that those anxieties bubbling up are kind of a direct threat to this idea of psychological safety, because people are sat there thinking, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what the impact's going to be on my job. I don't know whether this is going to be a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, is that your reading of that? I mean, and if that is the case, how should people deal with it? How should CEOs, leaders deal with that, do you think?
Yes, I do think that there will be some anxiety caused by AI, particularly because people will feel like it's going to replace their job. And I think it comes back to one of the most simple things is, as a CEO, say to your people, before we implement any AI, we're going to get your opinion on it.
Yeah,
And
so
do
pretty
that.
simple, really. It's about asking people what they think.
Just ask people what they think and say, if you, as with any system, whether it's AI, any type of technology, any type of thing that you're implementing in the business, if you implement it without people's views first, it always causes a little bit more problem. They don't feel included. They don't feel
Don't
part
feel
of the
any
plan.
ownership, do they? No, no
This
involvement,
is
no ownership is the
this is
rule, isn't
being
it?
done to me, not with me.
Yeah,
Classic.
yeah,
Just be honest about it.
yeah. And
We
it's
need to be more
interesting.
honest.
It's interesting you make that point because so often you come across CEOs that are very good at talking a lot. They're not necessarily so good at asking other people what they think, which is quite an interesting sort of dilemma, really.
Yeah.
Kristen, thank you for sharing a bit of wisdom around that. Very interesting world you inhabit, and I think a lots of the things you've talked about today will be very relevant to people that are trying to build businesses and so on. So really appreciate you making time to kind of talk through some of those issues. So thanks for coming on, and good
Thank
luck
you
going
for having
forward.
me.
I'm sure you've got plenty of interesting stuff to keep you occupied.
I have, yeah, very passionate about it. No, thank you very much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Cheers, Kristen. See you soon. Bye bye.